Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jude England. I'm Head of Social Sciences here at the library, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to our third British Library, British Sociological Association annual Equality Lecture. With this series, what we're trying to do is look at some of the key issues around equality, so the levels, causes, consequences, and more specifically looking at the question as to whether or not it might be inevitable. We started with Richard Wilkinson, who was co-author of a book called The Spirit Level, which took its theme the notion that the state of equality is better for everybody. Last year we had Danny Dorling from the University of Sheffield, whose work highlights the impact of equality and inequality on our lives, and he uses fantastic mapping techniques to bring that all to life. And this year we're absolutely delighted to have as our lecturer Professor Danielle Allen, who's the UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Science, Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Now, Danielle's a political theorist who's published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. And she's going to be introduced properly by Judith Burnett, who's chairing today's event. But I'm really pleased, actually, being part of the British Library, to welcome somebody who's described as combining the classicist's careful attention to text and language with the political theorist's sophisticated and informed engagement. And I quote again, as perhaps the most educated person to set foot in Westminster in 2012, which I think is a great accolade, but who's also a keen amateur boxer, although I understand that's a little bit in abeyance at the moment. But I think anybody who combines all of those skills has got to be worth listening to with all my ears and eyes and nose and everything. But I'm really looking forward to her talking about exploring how having a sort of joined-up society promotes equality. And we've been doing little else in the green room, but talking about the events of this last week or so and how pertinent this particular lecture is, given that one of the notions that's been hotly disputed or debated this week is whether there is or isn't such a thing as society. Judith Burnett, Professor Judith Burnett's our chair, and she's now from the University of Greenwich, and she's chair of the Political Sociological Association. And her work explores social change, particularly across the life course, within cohorts and generations, and looking at the emergence of the 30-somethings as an age-based identity and generational experience. And she'll say a few words on the event. So thanks very much for everybody coming. Over to Judith and Danielle.
So good evening to you all. As Judith said, I'm chair of the British Sociological Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the association, which we like to think of as a home for sociologists and for anyone, anywhere, who is interested in sociological understanding and is interested in exploring society in all of its different facets. The BSA, as it's known, the British Sociological Association, has got members who are sociologists actually working in academic institutions. We've also got members who take a passing interest in social research, who work outside of academia. And we are very pleased and proud indeed to engage with all manner of people who have a passing interest in all sorts of different disciplines and in different matters related to power, structure, status, identity, and so on and so forth. Therefore, we're very pleased to host with the British Library these series of lectures which explore different dimensions of equality and inequality. And we're therefore pleased to welcome Professor Danielle Allen from the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton for this third annual British Library BSA Equality Lecture. Danielle was a political theorist. She's widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. She's engaged in social and political affairs, as well as taking an intense interest in academic expression. and thus she's worked on the 2008 Obama campaign, amongst many other political and social activities. She continues to make these kinds of interventions and to stage these contributions. For example, today, a text from a talk that she gave to the Labour Policy Review here in Britain has come out in the journal Soundings, which you can Google. So the format today is that Danielle will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and debate amongst ourselves, after which the bar will be open. Okay, thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you so much for the welcome. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks very much, everybody, for being here this evening. It's an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you. And The Spirit Level is a book that I've made use of and been very grateful for. So the idea of being the third lecturer in a series that started that way is just terrific. And I'm hoping that for all of you, questions of equalities and inequalities are a conversation that's building, and that there's a sense in this country of increasing sophistication in thinking about those issues and how to redress them. And so I'm very looking forward to the question and answer session a lot to learn from you about what the state of the conversation is about equalities and inequalities in this country. I think a lot about democracy. That's my main subject and focus of my intellectual and personal commitments. So I wanted to begin by saying a word about how I define democracy in the first place. I take the idea of democracy to have a couple of core components. So for me, the most important thing in the first instance is that democracy is a form of political organization that protects people from domination. So I am not a person who thinks democracy is simply the least worst means of organizing social life. I think it actually is the right structure for unleashing human flourishing. In my view, the purpose of democracy is to empower individual citizens and give them sufficient control over their lives to protect themselves from domination. In its ideal form, democracies empower each and all such that none can dominate any of the others, nor any one group another group of citizens. But the best way to achieve freedom from domination, to avoid being dominated, is to contribute to creating the shared society. So one needs, as well as an ideal of non-domination, an ideal of co-creation and co-ownership of public life. So the point of political equality, the core of democracy in my view, is not merely to secure spaces free from domination, but also to engage all members of a community equally in the work of creating and constantly recreating that community. So political equality is fundamentally equal political empowerment. And the last point I want to make about democracy is simply that ideally, if political equality exists, citizens become co-creators of their shared world. So freedom from domination and the opportunity for co-creation maximize the space available for individual and collective human flourishing. So you can see already from this approach to democracy that I foreground the concept of political equality. So I want to say a little bit more about that. Equality is a complicated concept, and that is not the only form it needs to take. So what about social equality? What about economic equality? How do I think of these concepts as relating to each other? I think all three of them are necessary. Here, though, I've replaced economic equality with the phrase economic justice. Instead, I'll say more about that in a minute. And I've used this pyramid image to suggest that political equality can be the concept that one uses to get to questions both of social equality and of economic justice. When one sees conditions of great economic inequality as currently exist in this country and the US, political equality is also undermined. And assessments of levels of empowerment of people are a good way of getting at the question of whether one has achieved a sufficiently egalitarian distribution of resources in the first place. The concept of economic equality is itself extremely difficult, fraught concept. From my point of view, it becomes easier to think about just forms of distribution if one connects that concept quite closely to a concept of political equality or egalitarian political empowerment. But so I want to say a bit more about how each of these components of equality relates to each other. Ultimately, my lecture is going to focus on social equality, the bit in the middle, which is the bit that I think that as scholars and activists, we've focused the least on, where I think we still have the most to learn, and where I think the pieces that we are missing would help us all do a lot better at connecting questions of economic justice to questions of political equality. So let me say a bit more about how I think about economic justice. So it's a mode of distributing resources that's compatible with full and effective political participation. And one has to think about this both as a matter of the level of resources that enable individual empowerment, development of autonomy for particular people, and the kinds of issues of human development that pertain to that question, capabilities development. You might think of the work of economist Amartya Sen, for instance. It also means distributions of resources that relate to who controls the media, who controls public discourse, and who controls access to decision-making powers and structures. In the US, one can say now that there are certain kinds of policies that would make a big difference for us in restoring a kind of economic context that could support effective and full political participation. So what I want to do now is indicate those. They're very specific to the US. So I think in any given country, one has to start from a notion about distribution of resources that supports full and effective participation, and then ask the question, what are the policy choices in that country that would help achieve this? In the US, we very aggressively need to pursue increased levels of education throughout the population, not merely because that opens up opportunity for individuals, but because differentials in education lie behind the differentials in what people call the wage premium. That is one of the biggest drivers of income inequality. I can talk more about that in the question section if you want to. We've seen a remarkable reduction in the power of unions, and that reduction in power has affected wages for the middle class population dramatically, so that's another place where we need work. We need to rebuild manufacturing and supply chain jobs. A lot more that could be said about that, and the technology economy does open up possibilities for that, despite the fact that the norm is to think that everything has to be outsourced to Asia or something of the sort. And then lastly, we need to work on developing social equality. So that will kick us up to the next area. What do I mean by the idea of developing social equality exactly? Lots of work in the social sciences of late has built on social network theory. And this is work that recognizes that how people are connected with each other in their neighborhoods, in institutions, literally in the question of who knows whom, who's talking to whom, and so forth, has huge impacts on economic questions, questions of opportunity, and so forth. And in a country like the US, where segregation has been increasing for the last few decades, and that's both racial segregation and socioeconomic segregation, there are a lot of other kinds of inequality that track that rise in segregation. So the pursuit of social equality, of reorganization of social networks, is a key part, actually, of seeking, pursuing, and trying to create economic justice. So let me move on to the topic of social equality. My argument is that we should be pursuing what I call a connected society. And so this is one in which there are many kinds of social ties across cleavages, across differences of ethnicity or race or class. Sociologists often divide, the real sociologists will correct me on this probably, but often divide descriptions of relationships into the categories of bonding relationships, relationships with people who are very much like oneself, and bridging relationships, relationships that again cross one or another kind of demographic boundary. A connected society is one that maximizes bridging relationships particularly. And why does one want to do that? So there's been lots of research going back to the 70s that suggests that bridging relationships, these ones that connect different groups of people, bring kinds of benefits that bonding relationships don't. So for example, knowledge travels a lot faster over bridging ties or more distant ties. Even job opportunities come much more frequently from a person who is more distant socially as opposed to a person who's closer to oneself. And this makes sense if you stop and think about it, right? Because the people that you already know what they know. And so if you want to look for a new job, what you need to do is find a whole other group of people with access to a different kind of information, different pool of knowledge, and draw on that. So in general, knowledge circulates faster, opportunities circulate faster. Education is much more effective in contexts where people are not living in social isolation or segregation. And that's got to do with how language works, it has to do with how other kinds of cultural skills are transmitted and so forth. One can go through a list of economic effects, effects for democracy, and personal effects that relate to this question of social structure and the relative balance between bonding and bridging ties. And in general, the greater the percentage of bridging ties within any given society, the more egalitarian outcomes one sees across economic, political, and social aspects. So how exactly then does one begin to build a connected society? That's the sort of area that my own work is really focusing on these days. And so I would say that that's a matter of developing connected institutions and services. On the one hand, a sort of macro, big picture level question. And it's also a matter of people's ordinary habits, the habits they bring into all their daily interactions. And with regard to those, I think it's worth cultivating both a science and an art of association. So let me talk a little bit about the institutions and services piece for a moment, and then we'll come back a little bit later to the science and art of association. So any given institution can do a better or worse job of connecting different populations. I like to take universities as an example. And one of my favorites at the moment is a place called Lehigh in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Lehigh is the product of the wealth of Bethlehem steel, one of the drivers of the 19th and early 20th century American industrial economy. And it sits in now a community that's been decimated by the end of the steel industry and, again, the breaking of union power and so forth in the US. So you have a quite wealthy private university situated literally on a hilltop. At the bottom of the hill is a community mostly of Dominican and Puerto Rican immigrants who are plagued by all kinds of the basic issues of poverty, from asthma to domestic violence to unemployment, poor educational outcomes, and so forth. And for decades, the university has had nothing whatsoever to do with that local community. But there's a terrific, inventive, socially committed young professor there named Seth Moglen, who has been building programs, the purpose of which is to equip the local community with the kind of knowledge power that the university has. So for example, a big casino was planning on taking over the old steel plants, sort of moving into town. This was being done without any consultation or relationship to the community at all. And so what Seth did was start getting faculty members from a variety of departments, sociology, political science, history, and so forth, to start building research contexts for thinking about the casino industry in the US, what it means for communities, and the kinds of questions communities should be asking about such an industry. Built fora with members from the surrounding community and so forth. And the result of this was the discovery that, contrary to what a lot of people thought the biggest problem was likely to be from the arrival of the casino, the biggest problem was actually going to be pollution because of the traffic coming in from outside areas. And with a community that had high levels of asthma already, this was an issue that needed to be dealt with as people were thinking about, in fact, trying to restart the community with this casino. And so he was then able to bring journalists into the conversation and local politicians and so forth. But the point of all of this is that although people were living in one town together, they didn't have any institutional connections that permitted this sort of knowledge transfer and the kind of empowerment that rests on it. And it took a literal sort of rethinking of the institutional structure of the university for this to work. So they had to rethink how to organize classes, so that members of the community could participate without enrolling for a whole 4-year course, but could nonetheless participate in some units. And sort of down the list, there had to be structural rethinking about how the organization functioned. And it's that kind of thinking that can be done in any institution and can have real impacts on whether or not disparate communities are connecting to each other or interacting with each other. There are also questions, of course, at the big level of policy. So housing policy, transportation policy, employment policy, language policy. These are all policy areas that can have a big impact on whether or not disparate and different communities are connecting with each other in meaningful ways. So there's, I think, a lot of thought that could be put into building a more connected society through those kinds of instruments. What is the goal of all of this? The policy work in the area of economic justice and the policy work in the area of social equality. For me, as I said, it's political equality, and I'm just going to name for you what I take to be the components of political equality. I'm not going to speak about them at length, but I wanted to give you the sort of whole big picture within which the points I want to make about the art of association sit ultimately. So many people in the States, at any rate, have come to think of political equality as consisting primarily of civic and political rights, simply the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to serve in a jury. Those rights are fundamental, and in the States we are seeing erosions to them again, so one needs to pay attention to those rights. They can't be ignored, but they're only part of the story. And so for me, there are really 5 facets to the ideal of political equality. And again, I'm afraid I'm not going to spell them out for you here, other than to point to them. But one is this freedom from domination idea, which has a big economic component. Another is egalitarian access to the instrument of government, which is partly those civil rights, but it's also issues related to the media and things like that. Epistemic egalitarianism, which is a clunky phrase, but refers both to the notion that education needs to be as broadly dispersed as possible. The general population needs to be educated to the highest possible level, but then one also wants to approach any policy initiative, any public decision-making initiative from a point of view that draws on the knowledge that all citizens can contribute to the conversation. So in other words, one expects useful knowledge relevant to key public decisions to come from any context. And yes, one needs experts, but one also needs social knowledge, the knowledge of the meaning and impact of particular kinds of decisions, and one needs to bring these together into the decision-making process. Citizenly reciprocity is got to do with whether or not in relations between individuals there is an actual evenness of agency between them, a real possibility for egalitarian standing in relationship to each other. And then lastly, this ideal of co-creation or co-ownership. And again, I'm sorry just to list those so quickly without explaining them, but we can talk about them in the question section if you want to. So what I want to do now then for the rest of my talk is to focus on this idea of a connected society, and exactly what I think it means and where I think we need to improve our understanding in the effort to pursue it. So it's a very simple idea, and you've probably already picked it up basically, just simply the idea that the goal is to cultivate social networks and social relations to support economic justice and political equality. This formulation may trigger bells. That is, often I think when people think these days about social networks and social relations and their public value, their public good, they tend to use the concept of social capital to talk about what we're all trying to cultivate together as a society. And the most famous recent exponent of the idea is an American political scientist named Robert Putnam, who talks a lot about the idea that in a society that's functioning well, where there are good social relations and so forth, the society generates forms of trust that facilitate cooperation, facilitate a lot of other benefits like improved health outcomes, reduced criminality, and so forth. The concept has a longer genealogy, as I'm sure many of you know. So it starts in France with Pierre Bourdieu, for whom the concept of social capital was really one that individuals applied to a possession of individuals. So any given person with useful social contacts who could translate those social contacts into power of certain kinds had social capital. And in his analysis, it's a pretty inegalitarian phenomenon, right? So people with very useful social networks are better off. They take strategic advantage of those social networks as against people who are more isolated. An American economist, James Coleman, was also interested in the concept at the sort of micro level as it applied to individuals. But his focus had more to do with precisely what kinds of resources people get out of their social connections. And so that is some of the issues I was talking about before, things like what kind of access to information do you have, and so forth. So for him, too, there wasn't a strong emphasis on whether the effects of social capital were inegalitarian or egalitarian. But Putnam has taken the analysis to the level of collective groups and has wanted to make the argument that social capital, strong relations among people and so forth, are fundamentally necessary for democracy, and that they make the difference between democratic and non-democratic contexts. But lots of people have pointed out that Putnam's argument has some basic flaws in it. So for example, he first made this case in a 1993 book called Making Democracy Work, which was about Italy. And in that argument, he makes the case that northern Italy is economically more successful than southern Italy, precisely because it has much richer social capital networks and so forth. But critics immediately pointed out that northern Italy was also a much more fascist part of Italy than southern Italy. And so the same things that Putnam argued were supporting democracy in the second half of the 20th century had in fact supported the success of fascism in the first part of the 20th century. So more work needs to be done on the concept in order to figure out what version of this concept really does support egalitarian political outcomes and truly democratic forms of social life. And so this is where I'm hoping to make a little bit of an intervention in how the concept is used. In distinguishing between egalitarian and inegalitarian social capital, I think the critical thing is this issue of the relative proportion of bonding and bridging ties within any given community. And scholars who've been working on health disparities have pointed this out, for instance, as well as scholars working on other particular small communities in an anthropological context. It's really bridging ties, again, ties between people who are socially quite distant from each other that bring the genuinely equalizing effects. So that's why then the focus needs to be on exactly how to generate bridging ties as opposed simply to bonding ties. So to repeat my point there. Okay, so this is where my focus is, on bridging ties. This leads to a certain kind of problem, though. This emphasis on bridging ties is, in effect, an emphasis on diversity, on figuring out how to not merely take advantage of diversity, but generate more of it in the sense of bringing more diversity into any given institutional form or structure. And Putnam, as well, in his argument, has made the case that actually there's a trade-off between diversity and community, that contexts of diversity, in fact, make it harder for people to form meaningful ties, that precisely the bridging ties in which I'm interested in are those ties that are also likely to erode community. And I'm focusing on Putnam because he's been such a huge influence on public policy debate in the US and in Europe as well to some degree. And I think this point of his is it's an error of such significant proportions that we need to stop and pay attention to it and think through exactly what's wrong with the claim. So what's wrong with Putnam's view about the relationship between diversity and community? First, a word about how he came to it. He did studies in the US and also in Europe that focused on urban neighborhoods with high levels of diversity and found lower levels of trust, lower levels of neighborly interaction, and that sort of thing in those contexts. But the problem with his analysis is that it assumes that the techniques that are relevant to producing ties, effective ties, to generating trust and so forth, are historically stable, okay? In other words, it assumes that there is just such a thing as knowing how to produce social ties, and one can look at any given community and judge how well people are doing at producing ties, as opposed to taking the view that it might well be the case that particular arts for cultivating association have evolved in particular contexts, such that as contexts change, the arts of association need to evolve as well. And it's that evolutionary view about the art of association that I want to argue for with all of you this evening. So we have to dig into a little bit more to Putnam's argument and to the history on which his argument is based. So in 2000, he published an important book called Bowling Alone, which is very specifically a story about the US and a supposed decline in social capital in the US between 1970 and 1990. And the heart of the book is this graph, which indicates average membership rates in 32 chapter-based associations. So these are associations like the Optimists Club and the Odd Fellows, which I know the Odd Fellows still exist in Britain as well, although it's tiny at this point. The Rotary Club. So service organizations that tended to be populated in the 50s and 60s by, for example, local businessmen or civic leaders and so forth. And so I don't know how, you can't see the dates here really, but so that peak is about 1970, and then the numbers drop off to 1990. So what was Putnam's explanation for this change? Again, sorry, you can't really see this terribly well, but he indicates that in his guesstimated view, he thinks the biggest part of the change is something that he just calls generational change. Okay, so changes in people's practices. And then you've got work and sprawl, so commuting basically, and the effect of increased time spent on the job, and television, and then other, sort of unexplained part. But the amazing thing about Putnam's argument is that in exactly the period from 1970 to 1990, the US Supreme Court completely rewrote the law of association in the US and made the membership policies of 26 of his 32 organizations illegal. So let me explain that. Okay, so he mentions the court once in his book to refer to an 1896 decision. So let me just go through this. Basically, starting in the early 70s, people started litigating whether or not these clubs could be all male. And by 84, the first major case, and then 87, the Supreme Court decided that they couldn't be. But from the early 70s, that question was up for grabs. And the period of that membership decline precisely tracks the period of that litigation. And you're not going to be able to see the following batch of, well, so what did the court say exactly about this change? The state's compelling interests in eliminating discrimination against women and assuring them equal access to public accommodations extends to the acquisition of leadership skills and business contacts, as well as tangible goods and services. This is a hugely important piece of US law that we haven't actually really mined in full. What it means is that what we call our equal protection clause, which gives everybody equal protection of their rights, applies not just to things like voting, but also to the distribution of social capital, actually. And the implications of that are profound if we were to take the time to spell it out. I won't do that right now. But the other important point in this idea is that the court was saying, basically, the habits that you've had for generating associations, the art of association that you've used, is not constitutional. We recognize the value of association, but you need to figure out how to do it in a way that also succeeds at achieving an egalitarian distribution of social capital. Okay? So the court, in doing this, conceptually distinguished between inegalitarian and egalitarian social capital. And the distinction hinged precisely on an implicit idea of bridging relationships. That is, it was not okay for men to be bonding with men. They needed to bring women into the associations as well and rest those associations on habits that supported bridging as well as bonding. Okay? So they essentially challenged the participants in US civil society to develop a new art of association. This is what Putnam didn't see. So it's true, I'll come back to that in a second. It's true that the associations fell off. Don't worry about this, I'm sure it's hard to see, so don't worry about it for the moment. It's true that they declined, but the important thing is that they declined for a reason, that there was something that they had to learn, which by and large they failed to learn. And so I took the time just to sort of break Putnam's organizations out into a list that was actually affected by the law. That's what's on the left side here. So you don't need to worry about the names. And then a group of associations that was not affected by the legal change, either associations that were already gender integrated or which were protected from gender integration by a religious exemption, for example, okay? And the statistics then of what happened to these groups are completely different. So the median decline for all of them was 58% in terms of membership. For groups that were already gender integrated or legally protected, 18%. And if you take out agricultural groups and the NAACP, which had very anomalous experiences in the 20th century because agricultural production changed so dramatically in the US, the median decline for these groups that weren't affected by the legal change was 12%. So the point of saying that is that the decline that Putnam spots doesn't have to do in the degree that he thought with things like commuting and sprawl and television and so forth. Instead, it had to do with this challenge set to American civil society to reinvent the art of association. And there's one success story on the list, only one, which would merit research. The veterans of foreign wars, as it happened, did not decline particularly. And so somebody needs to do the history of exactly what they did to make it through this period. And they're a funny organization because they started their life in the early 20th century as a gender-integrated organization because nurses in World War I could be members of this association. In 1944, they decided to make themselves all male and to rule out women. And then in 1978, they reversed course again on their own in advance of the legal decisions and re-embraced gender integration. So there's a story there about what it takes to make it through these transitions and how one can go about, in fact, learning an art of association that focuses on bridging ties. I don't know the story right now, but I'm pointing to that because I think it would be terrific if somebody picked that up as a research question. So I want to go back really fast to Tocqueville, who is, in some sense, the founding father figure for researchers who have drawn on the concept of social capital in the American context in particular. And this remark he made about the science and art of association, because it's from him really that we get this vocabulary. So he said, thus the most democratic country on the earth finds itself to be the one where men have brought to the greatest perfection of our day the art of pursuing together or in association the object of their shared desires. And they've applied this new science to the greatest number of objects. So for Tocqueville, there was this connection between democracy and the ability to work through associations to achieve things. But the point I want to stress about Tocqueville's original insight is that he had a direct sense of the historicity of this science and art. So it wasn't that 19th century Americans had perfected the art and science of association, which is often how this passage is interpreted. They had only brought that art to the greatest perfection of their own day. And in that notion of a historical limit, I think one also can find then a sense of possibility, that the art and science of association are things that need to be developed in our day to a different kind of level than applied in the 19th century. And I would say basically that in that picture of decline that Putnam gives us, just going back to that picture again, what that is really a picture of is the inadequacy of the 19th century art of association to the 20th and 21st century. And so it's not a sad story, to the contrary. It's a story about our discovery of a need for significant inventiveness, significant forward movement in understanding the science and art of association. And so what do I mean exactly? What do we need in this area? With regard to the science, there I mean literally the conceptual components of understanding how to build bridging relationships, make them healthy, and take advantage of them. And I take the Supreme Court's discovery, for example, of a distinction between inegalitarian and egalitarian social capital to be an example of progress in the science of associations. But so what about the art? What kind of art can rest on top of an evolved science of association? Here, I think, again, we have massive amounts of work to do to learn exactly what it takes for human beings to be effective at building bridging relationships. And there's work in psychology and human development at the moment that's starting to get to this question. How, in context of diversity, can people achieve a kind of comfort, interactional comfort that permits success? And so I just want to point to what I think of as the materials that we can draw on for fleshing out the art of association. So I've made an argument in previous work that we need to pursue an ideal of political friendship in our civic relations, which is a matter of, in fact, reaching out to strangers, reaching out to others, and finding ways of establishing habits and practices of equity in our relationship to one another. It's a matter, in some sense, of taking the habits of friendship and applying them in a political context. The idea is not terribly original. I get it ultimately from Aristotle. And Aristotle made the case, that's where I always get things, but just try to pretend that I thought of them myself. Anyway, so Aristotle made the argument that he's got this story about virtues. Any virtue is a mean or midway point between two things. So take the virtue of courage, for example. The virtue of courage is a mean between being too rash, rushing into a burning building before if you know if anybody's inside. And on the one hand, you want to avoid that, and you also don't want to be a coward, a person who won't go into a burning building even though you know somebody's inside. So courage combines the willingness to act with understanding and so forth. He's got one virtue in his long list that he says is an unnamed virtue, and he describes it as a virtue for interacting with strangers. And it's a midway point between domination on the one hand, which he describes as not caring what kind of harm you cause to others, and on the other side, obsequiousness, or just trying to stay out of the way, not making trouble, making nothing of yourself in some sense in order to smooth things out. And he says of that unnamed midpoint between being domineering and being acquiescent, that it's like friendship, but without the emotional element. And what does that mean to say that it's like friendship, but without the emotional element? It's a very astute recognition that the things we learn to do with our friends become habits, and that one can separate those habits from the emotional tie that brought us to that person in the first place. And one can use those habits even with strangers or people one doesn't like. And lots of relational possibilities open up when one does that. So that seems to me actually a very important part of the kind of ethics and etiquette of public action that constitutes fully democratic citizenship. At the same time, though, that one might make arguments about how citizens in public spaces should interact with each other, as I've just done, and take a notion of friendship and try to convert it into something else that's also about fostering healthy relations in contexts of diversity. Nonetheless, what I've done, that argument still depends on the notion that people have this prior or pre-existent experience of friendship or intimate relations, and that the habits that they've developed in those contexts of intimacy can be translated in usefully democratic, usefully egalitarian ways into the public sphere. So then there's a real question about how people are learning how to bond in intimate spaces anyway. Are there bonding relations in contexts of intimacy actually relationships that can support a capacity to bridge in public contexts? So in other words, this leads to the question of whether or not we bond in ways that make it possible for us to bridge, okay? So the idea is that how one bonds in context of intimacy is really important for whether or not one can be effective at building bridges. So what do we know about that subject? I really wanted just to point you to some research that started to take this up. There's a psychologist named Philip Bromberg who's begun to work on relational attunement that is useful for thinking about this question. There is work in the area of sociology of learning that takes this up as well. Also work in the area of interpretation studies and studies of recognition. So I'm not going to spell out everything that's in this research now. The reason I'm not spelling it out is because it's very fragmentary terrain. There isn't really a good account at the moment of what it takes in terms of human development for people to become good at bridging on the basis of the kinds of intimate or bonding relationships that they're developing. So they're just sort of little tentacles of research in this area in psychology and so forth. But it's important because over and over again in studies of diversity, one gets research results that suggest diversity really, and institutional and social contexts that draw on diversity really do offer greater strengths in terms of creativity, problem solving, egalitarian relationships, and so forth, but only when people overcome a relational challenge, relational difficulties. And so I think it's, for anybody who cares about building social contexts that support equality, one of the most important things that we can be doing actually is figuring out how to foster the kinds of human development that give people the skills and competencies to form bridging relationships. So I'm concluding then, I'm going to end by leaving something wide open, not giving you an answer to the question of exactly how we build the relationships that support the spread of bridging ties throughout society, but trying to suggest to you that this is one of the most important things that any of us can think about at the moment. So where does that leave us exactly? In my view, as I said, economic justice or equality, social equality, and political equality need to be put in relationship to each other. In my view, we already know a lot about economic justice, and we basically know what we need to do, okay? But at the same time that we know all of that, the one thing that we don't really know terribly well, which is a missing key, is the question of how to approach social equality. And I think the more that we could do to improve an art of association that permits the construction of bridging relationships, and the more that we bring such an art into how we build our own institutions and organizations, the better the position that we'll be in to tackle the questions of economic justice, so that economic justice and social equality can be working together to foster political equality. So that's my hope, is that I'm not the only one who will think that these questions are worth pursuing, and that by breaking it down in this way, it might help all of us to think about exactly how and in what components to tackle the problems of inequality that we are all experiencing and coming to understand better in not just this country, but the US and more generally around the globe. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Is this on now? Thank you very much for that. That was fascinating.
Pleasure. That's good.
Okay, can I ask then for any questions? If you'd like to raise your hand. Okay, there's one lady at the front here in a pink scarf, so we'll just bring you a mic. Lady here, the third row back. Here we are. Okay.
That was absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, that's very kind.
Enough to think about for a year, I think. I'm going to slowly unpack it all. I'm thinking aloud. I can't. You sort of. No, just turn it up a bit. Up like that. Okay. I belong to a kind of centre-left thing called Compass, and it's fascinating how the parallels are being developed there. They're using the word cooperation, and they're using language of cooperation. I'm very interested in speech and language and how we use words. And I think that's going to be a huge issue because I think we've lost the language of cooperation. We knew it. Thatcher, at the moment, is obsessing everybody. But she's one of the people that destroyed it and began to... I went onto a blog the other day because my son's on it, who's 20, and he said, put your stuff on there because they haven't heard of Thatcher. And I did. I did mainstream centre-left stuff, and they called me an extremist.
Wow.
And I was using a different language.
Right.
And I wonder how we can start making links through language when that language is so unfamiliar to a lot of people.
Right. No, thank you. I am also a big believer in language and think that an important thing to do is to, actually, so it's kind of a group, to build sound bites. I'm a big believer in building sound bites, philosophically meaningful, rich sound bites. So for me, a connected society is one of those. I don't know if it will work, but what I try to do is justify a phrase and give it serious content, but nonetheless make it easy for people to remember, carry it around, think about it, and so forth. In that particular phrase, one of the things I'm trying to do is to suggest a move beyond the concept of integration, actually. So, for instance, in the context of the UK may be different from the US context, and so I apologize if I am missing something or just tone deaf to something. But in the US, integration was a concept that reigned in the 50s and 60s and so forth. And that was really a period in American social science before the impact of social network theory. Social network theory has done a really good job of showing a picture of social structure that can see sort of nodes of interaction, sort of groups of people that are closer together or farther apart and so forth. The problem with the integration concept is that it sort of imagines a world in which everybody is kind of equally related to everybody else. Whereas in fact, we do all build bonding relationships and points of denser connection and so forth. And so the hard challenge in context of diversity is how to recognize that people need contexts of solidarity, they need bonding relationships, but they also need to do that in a context that doesn't generate isolation. So the idea of a connected society is one in which communities are all connected to each other and that there's a lot of transmission and flow and sharing across divisions and so forth, but not a total evening out of social context. The point of saying all of this is simply to say that I didn't say any of that to you in my talk, right, when I used the phrase a connected society. But my hope would be that over time, as people started to think through that concept, like what does she actually mean by that and so forth, people would work their way to some of those other ideas. That didn't directly answer your question. The only point is just that I think fixing language requires fixing language. That is to say, we all have to make a contribution to a kind of language that can get us back to a richer understanding of society.
Again, yes, I mean, incredibly powerful talk, so thank you. But the issue of bridging and bonding, and you started to sort of address the issue in the sense it often looks as if bonding is the problem, you need bridging instead of bonding. But of course, bridging is a form of bonding. It's, in a sense, extending the bonds across. So, and yet it's often presented as if bonding is a problem. And bonding, and usually from the perspective of elite discourses, it's which PUTNAM is sort of seeking to influence. That elite discourse is, in a sense, the problem of the poor is their lack of bridging and their bonding. And it's never put the other way around. The problem of the wealthy is their bonding and lack of bridging. So in a sense, the issue is the absence of the connections and solidarity of the wealthy. That seems to me almost to be a definition of domination. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would be interesting, it says not simply to have the objective that democracy is about not having domination, but that actually we do have domination, and an index to domination is the extent of bonding amongst the wealthy, because then one can talk specifically about elites and start to have an argument that what we need is, in a sense, to break the structures of elites, to build democracy as well as build solidarity from and bridges from below.
Yes. Thank you. No, I am trying to argue for the deconstruction of the kinds of bonding relationships that support elites and elite separation and elite mastery. So yes, thank you. It's a terrific extension of what I'm trying to argue.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, just following on from that question, I just was interested in the sense in which many of the strongest bonds of association are formed in the face of oppression or against the domination. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what you'd say about the recent history of universities in that context, because especially in relation to gender, I mean, the college that we both went to only allowed women in 1971, which was the year we were born. And that seemed very recent at the time when we were studying. And I wondered, I mean, that's a question of gender equality, but also how does that relate to social equality? Because within our lifetimes, the access to education in Britain has changed so dramatically. And I was interested, I mean, it's one of the biggest differences between America and Britain, of education being whether higher education is a right or a privilege. And I wondered how you saw these ideas of association, or what you saw the role of the university to be in taking forward some of these ideas, because they have to be sort of carried out in practice as well as theory. And for people working in British universities, it looks rather bleak at the moment in terms of the return of an elite when perhaps that was beginning to break down. So.
I mean, so we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I mean, higher ed actually is also something I'm thinking about a lot these days and working on. And yes, I do think that the democratization, the re-democratization of universities is a pressing public need. I think the picture is different in the States from in Britain. In the States, the thing that we really need is a reinvestment by states in the California, Florida, Michigan sense in our state university system. And it's complicated. And that actually will probably be easier for us than it will be for you in this country to reintroduce the notion of universities as a public good. And that's complicated as to why. But because of the way our small states, again, Florida, California, Michigan, and so forth, compete with each other, there is a force that should generate some reinvestment in universities there. So at any rate, I think that's a key thing. In the US, another key thing in the US is recruitment across a diversity of populations, which we continue to be very bad at. But we're also bad at that because of how the K through 12 system works. So from my point of view, you can't think about higher ed separately from how one thinks about schools. And there's a way in which, I mean, one does need to reconstitute the notion that universities are a public good and need to be supported as a public good. But one also simultaneously needs to build structures at the primary school level that are integrating student populations in primary schools to opportunities and possibilities that currently often particular schools live in isolation from. So it seems to me one has to work on both fronts at once if one wants a truly democratized educational system.
Okay, thank you. So we have two in the front row here, please. We come here. Gentleman in the red tie first, thank you.
Hi. Returning to the original point about the development of language concerning the evolution of social values, and you said that it would offer a richer understanding of society with the use of language and sound bites. And I find this particularly interesting being a student, because I think that the use of sound bites and the use of language concerning about like cooperation in the big society and about all these quite overwhelming political ideals, it leads to quite an overwhelming disillusionment with society and political system in general, because people don't really see a correlation between action and like sweeping political statements about cooperation. And when we constantly hear politicians talk about we want to pursue individual ideals, we want to pursue society, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. And so the evolution of language and development of language doesn't really correlate with social action.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I guess there are two different things I would want to say. So I am an advocate of sound bites, okay, which is a unusual position to take. Most people don't, stand up and say, I'm in favor of sound bites. And I don't think that they in themselves need to corrode public discourse. So I think, you've put your finger on something when you say there's a disconnect between what people say and action. And so for me, I mean, sound bites are useful and valuable, in contexts where they are connected to a much bigger, richer account of what's behind them, right? In other words, I don't believe in just throwing out phrases because they are harmonious and catch people's attention. I think one has to earn the use of sound bites, basically. And then beyond that, I mean, you're quite right. That is to say, if they don't generate an actual change in a person's practice, then they also become meaningless. So for me, I mean, I'm an advocate also of, in politics, what people have come to call participatory politics, a variety of forms of local engagement, grassroots engagement, and things like that. And so, I think one does need to see change in people's behavior and action to go along with language, and otherwise it is empty. So, but I guess I would just encourage you not to give up on the prospect of developing serious and meaningful arguments about public life that can both be captured in phrases that stick and can generate real changes in practice. So don't give up.
Okay, there's a gentleman next. Yeah, thank you.
Could I think my question is really on two parts. One is really, what do we associate for? Because there may be an art and a science to association, but what really are we associating for? What is the purpose of that? There are sort of two different ways of looking at it. Well, one, and sort of slightly global examples, one in India, and I noticed about reservation policy, which was an extreme version of diversity imposition, but quite effective in sort of a social surveillance mechanism, where the rich were forced to take into account of people they'd never really come into contact with. That's been slightly skewed as a generational thing because the sons and daughters of people who took advantage of quotas have merely replicated the elite. And secondly, in the Basque Country, where I noticed the Spanish Constitution offered a great deal of scope for cooperative ventures, tax breaks, the state again intervening to give people a reason to associate. So to the extent where disused garages would be taken over by teenagers to form their own youth clubs, which I thought was sort of Cameron's big society, if you like, in the Basque Country. In this country, I find it very difficult to know what people associate for. In actual fact, the old Edwardian period where mutuals and cooperatives flourished really were taken over by insurance industries and then by the state. Now, most effective things are things like the National Trust, where if you want to save an old country home, people will come together and raise £10 million. But what do they? I would struggle in a British context to find really vibrant examples of the kind of political mission, social mission that association. I mean, all the rest of it's brilliant, science and art, great. But what do we dissociate for in this country? I struggle to answer that.
I feel like I should let Mr. Baskerville answer, was it London Citizens United?
Sure, if you'd like me to.
Sure, go for it.
Hello?
Pass that one back. Yeah.
Is this working? Yeah. So my name's Stefan Baskerville. I work for Citizens UK. So we are the national home of community organising, and in many ways a practical expression of lots of the things that that Danielle is talking about. And I suppose people associate for lots of different reasons. Our membership is largely faith and education institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, schools, primary schools, universities, departments, and student unions, some trade union branches here and there. So that's why Danielle pointed at me and said, well, I'd like to answer why people... And I think people associate for a whole host of reasons, partly because their kids are in the same school and they come together through a PTA. So I was involved with the setting up of a PTA in Marylebone at a primary school that didn't have a parent-teacher association. And they're associating there because they're worried about their kids crossing the street outside the school gates. But they're also worried about levels of pollution. They're worried about crime levels on their local estate. They're worried about the quality of teaching inside the school and their children's food at lunchtime, which they think is substandard, etc., etc., etc. So I think my experience of people is that they have lots of common interests, which they discover if they're willing to relate to each other, and then you end up associating around those interests. And that might be from an inherited faith tradition or a chosen faith tradition, or it might just be from a discovery of kind of common material interest. So that would be my answer to you. But my question to you would be, if bonding, if we're getting to the place where bonding ties are a really important part of the formation of people's ability to relate and their capacity eventually to bridge, what do you think about faith schools? where, and I'm genuinely interested. I don't know what I think. I'm not speaking on behalf of Citizens UK. I don't know what I think about faith schools. I mean, maybe it's a really good thing for young people to grow up in a context where they really know how to bond with people who are like them, and slowly through their education they begin to relate to people outside, and they're going to be really very good at bridging.
So let me come back to this question for a second, and then I'll also answer your question. Thank you, and thank you for your answer, which I would agree with, though, and I would say, so people associate the world over in differing degrees, but because they share a concern or a problem or an anxiety, and the question is whether or not, the moment of two people standing together and griping and complaining with each other turns into action or not. And the question, what does it take to make that conversion? But I would add another footnote, which is that we all associate all the time in our jobs and workplaces and so forth. And so part of the argument I was making about, think about an institution and think about how would one reorganize it, restructure it in order to do a better job of letting that institution support, foster bridging ties and so forth. It's really an invitation to think about all of the organizations of which one's already a part as associations, which one can help nudge in a more connected direction or not. And lots of people nudging makes a big difference, basically, even if it's only a nudge for that individual. But with regard to bonding relationships and faith schools and so forth, I think there are different types of bonding. That's what I'm trying to work my way toward understanding. And so exactly what I'm trying to work my way toward understanding is what are the types of bonding that support bridging capacities. And I think that there's simply a difference in terms of the kinds of bonding that can do that or not. So it seems to me that there would be ways to bond, to be in intimate relationships that nonetheless teach a sort of openness to the participation of anybody in the kinds of values and so forth that one is in that community for. That's too simple because it's more complicated than that, because sometimes communities' values are sort of by definition about exclusion. And so there is a way in which my argument pushes solidaristic communities away from a notion of exclusivity. So how do you generate and take advantage of solidarity without needing an element of exclusivity worked into it? It seems to me possible, but I think I still have a lot of thinking through to do to understand what that really means. So.
Great. Okay, another question? Yes, the gentleman up the aisle there on the right-hand side. Thank you.
Also, the woman in the red sweater had her hand right at the very beginning, so she's been.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I was interested to hear that you've been advising the Labour Party, partly because of some of the comments that people made, partly because I'm speaking as a former Labour MP who struggled with a circle that I don't think we've managed yet to square between the principle and value of cooperation and the siren call of aspiration. Now, we just heard examples of people coming together to form associations when they had a very clear and perhaps limited objective in mind to achieve an end for their child, for themselves, and so on and so forth. Seems to me a more valuable kind of cooperation is to achieve an end, yes, for yourself and your family, but also implicitly to understand the need to achieve an end for somebody else.
Right.
Which I guess is closer to an Athenian idea of citizenship. So my question really is that in a culture in which there is a consensus between all the major parties that aspiration, even in this time of economic difficulty, must be the objective for all people at all time, does that not undermine the very basis of the idea of cooperation that says that when we work together to achieve a public good, a common end, we create a better society, even if we are not perhaps as materially advantaged as we may be, if we actually focus on inequality as opposed to equality?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So So, I mean, I think you're right that the discourse of competition and personal success and advancement and so forth has eroded our capacity to see the connection between collective success and well-being. My own response to that has been to focus on the concept of well-being rather than the concept of aspiration. To recognize everybody needs material necessities do need to be dealt with. So it's not that by thinking about well-being, one's ignoring that question. And I think one does need to think about the sort of general prosperity of the whole society, right? But one then can, I think, move beyond that and ask questions about well-being, which relate to a lot of other features of people's experience other than simply income or sort of career ladder success. And actually, I mean, this is a place where the UN has a well-being index. I find that useful. I find that to be a way of expanding the conversation and encouraging people to think about other things like levels of education from a point of view of sort of human flourishing, not simply income and so forth. The degree of agency and autonomy people have in their social relations, which relates to issues of gender equity and gender equality and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I guess I see some inroads being made in public conversations, and the place where I see progress being made is sort of around policy initiatives and so forth that have adopted the concepts of well-being analysis. I don't know if that responded to your question or not. But.
Well, I think it does, so long as aspiration becomes increasingly more about well-being than it does about self-interest.
Right.
But I wonder whether any party, including my own, is yet courageous enough to say to people there must now be a ceiling on getting richer and richer every year. Firstly, in the current economic climate, that's not possible, and secondly, the consequences of it are the atomization of our society and the collapse of cooperation, which at the end of the process actually is the guarantor of well-being.
Right. So maybe just one more footnote on that subject, if that's okay, real fast. So for me, another thing that is important is to revise the concept of self-interest, to make distinctions between types of self-interest. Right. So I talk about the dominant concept that we all, that we all hear all the time as rivalrous self-interest, and juxtapose it to a concept that I call equitable self-interest, which precisely recognizes that unless one's society flourishes, one can't flourish, in the same way that unless one's kinship group flourishes, one can't flourish, and so forth. And that one has to take into account the survival of the whole of which one's part as part of one's own well-being. So I've been trying to push that kind of notion of equitable self-interest. And I could direct you to a Harvard economist named Danny Roderick, R-O-D-R-I-K, who's also started working on the concept of interest and pursuing revisions in this kind of way. And so I think it's the very beginnings of a change in that concept, but I think it's changeable. And I think actually directly tackling the concept of self-interest is a way to start to displace the rivalrous version of it that has predominated for the last 3 decades. So
that row there, yes, there she is.
I really enjoyed your paper, and I really welcome in particular the support your argument gives for challenging this diversity up, community down argument, which I think circulates at a kind of a very powerful level of popular discourse in race politics in the UK. Right. So, I'm thinking of Trevor Phillips' concerns here and things like that. But I wonder if you'd say something, it does also connect to the last question, about your choice of the term economic justice, not economic equality. Right. Because although it was, I'd probably share it, or I start with it, there's a way in UK popular equality politics, there's a slippage of, there's only 2 steps between that and a kind of a conservative discourse of fairness and a kind of, and then a very limited mealy-mouthed conditional welfarism. So
Right.
I just wondered if you'd say something about that definition or how you're using it.
Sure. So why do I use economic justice? So I think one can talk about egalitarian economic conditions, and which is what I mean by economic justice, but I think the concept of economic equality simply gets one into trouble because when economies are too dynamic to achieve literal sameness, which is the charge that's then raised against arguments about economic equality, right? And I think a lot of the vulnerability of the economic justice argument for the last couple of decades comes from how easy it is to make a mess out of the concept of economic equality. So, and for me, so tying the question of economic justice to the question of political equality is a way to maintain what I take to be the most important force in the central part of the economic egalitarianism argument without being vulnerable to that particular kind of critique.
Okay, good. Should we come down this side of the room first, please? Thank you. There's a lady in the green blouse there. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, what do you think the effects of the economic principles of the 1970s, particularly the neoliberal principles, have had an effect on everything? Because looking at everything and sort of touching on what everyone's saying and everyone's comments, I mean, if we actually have to go back to that point, massive changes were made then, and that's, I think, what we're feeling the effects of now in society and how people relate to one another, and the growth particularly on the PR industry within politics itself. I mean, Obama says it himself, we need to make ourselves more competitive. Countries are competing with each other for this notion of we have to be more competitive under the neoliberal economic principles of, your Reaganomics and Thatcherism. Mm-hmm. So where do we go from there? Because it's clearly not working.
Right.
And it's creating further problems. And politics is becoming a game of just PR. It's constant. I mean, Obama won, the PR award for his campaign. I mean, it's getting to this point where it becomes quite fudgy, and we're making really big decisions now, which are having really long-term, lasting effects through globalization globally. It's not we can't look at nations in isolation anymore.
Yeah, no,
and that is
true.
the result of the 1970s. So, maybe your thoughts on that?
So again, I'm going to cite the same person. So somebody I've learned a lot from is a fellow at Harvard named Danny Roderick. He's got a really good book from, I think, 2007, maybe, called The Globalization Paradox, which is an argument about, he calls it the globalization trilemma, that the country can't have democracy, national sovereignty, and sort of globalization growth, as we've come to think of it in a neoliberal context, and so that something has to give basically among those things. So, and has some very helpful and interesting things to say about what it takes to preserve democracy, what you need to do economically, and so forth. To some extent, the policies I tried to point to the beginning of my talk in the U.S. context are my answer to that question in the U.S. context. So there are things that can be done to reduce income inequality and strengthen, material possibilities and so forth through the bottom three quartiles of the income distribution, and but the right policies for achieving that will be different in every country, and that's one of his major contributions has been to provide a set of analytics, development analytics basically, for identifying specifically what's necessary in policy terms for strengthening egalitarian outcomes and so forth. And I mean, his methods are things that have begun to be used more in developing countries, and in some sense, what I'm arguing is to sort of take that style and approach and bring it back to developed countries, so that one doesn't expect the same answers from one country to the next. One expects diversity and difference in terms of economic policy in any particular country, and that's what you actually need in order to achieve the appropriate kinds of economic outcomes to support democracy. So, in other words, I think we have a lot of work to do. I think political economy, political economy is not a strong discipline at the moment, partly because of the impacts of the neoliberal paradigm and its complete, takeover of that intellectual space. But there are, again, some sort of incipient efforts to provide a new account. So that's where I would point you, basically.
We have time just for one or two more questions. Down here on the front, please.
Hi, thanks for that. I thought it was an incredibly powerful talk, and I really liked both the talk and your previous work. I wanted to ask you a question, though. I mean, in terms of how do you account for groups who may live within the polity but don't wish to associate? And here I'm thinking particularly of the US and particularly of the relationship to the native inhabitants of the US who may not wish to be associated in the forms of association that are being established. And what space is there for a consideration of them and their understandings within the sort of powerful accounts you're putting forward otherwise?
That's a terrific question. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I don't think I'm going to have a good answer to it. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't thought about that particular formulation of the issue of different communities. And so I guess for me, the answer would depend an awful lot on what that community in particular or another equivalent community would say about itself and its own desires. So, one of the goals of focusing on bridging relationships the way I am focusing on them and focusing on a notion of a connected society instead of integration is to build social space where it's possible for people to preserve senses of self, local communities and so forth without being isolated and disconnected, so that people can have the benefits of being part of a much larger community and thrive on account of that without having to give up personal community, senses of identity, and that sort of thing. I don't know if that would be of interest to a community like the Native American community in the US. And I mean, it's been a long-standing debate, right, within the Native American community. To what degree are Native American communities better off by virtue of connection to the U.S. structures, and to what degree are they worse off because of all the sorts of exceptions and so forth that pertain to them? So, so thank you for your question. I think it's something I need to think about, but I would want to do that first by talking to people who are living in that context.
So when you were talking about economic justice, you said in the US context that we know what we need to do. And I agree with you on that. And one thing that I find when I'm speaking with other Americans is that something that prevents what at least we think needs to be done from happening are beliefs about economic inequality and specifically social mobility. And namely that many Americans sort of grossly overestimate the degree of social mobility that exists in the United States. And that this sort of ties into a greater worldview of, what it means to be in poverty or what gets you out of poverty in terms of the virtue of a work ethic. And so the question that I have for you is that, first of all, do you think that these sort of beliefs that are almost fundamental beliefs about the way, quote unquote, the way the world works, do you think that they are a problem? And second, if particularly in the American context they are a problem, when you talk about a connected society, do you think that that could possibly influence beliefs?
So, thank you. Yes, I think those beliefs are a problem, and I do think they matter. When Occupy Wall Street was unfolding, one of the big debates about it was whether they'd done anything or whether it was basically meaningless. So the criticism tended to be they didn't have a policy agenda, right? They didn't take it into legislation and so forth. And the answer to that question, the real question about whether or not they did anything, relates to what the actual goal was. So Occupy Wall Street was the brainchild of a group called Adbusters. Have many of you heard of Adbusters? Just a couple people. So, okay, Adbusters. So if you think about the anti-sweatshop labor campaigns, like when people take the Nike icon and reconfigure it to make fun of Nike and change people's understanding of what that company is about. That's the kind of thing that Adbusters does. So they do fake ads that are subversive and criticize corporations and so forth. They call that culture jamming. And the method is based on various kinds of art-making practices from the early 20th century and so forth, various kinds of politically pointed art-making practice. So the point of Occupy Wall Street was precisely to get the 99%, 1% meme into American public discourse. Right? It wasn't, they didn't have a policy agenda. They had a soundbite agenda. And they did get that meme into American public discourse. And I think it is actually starting to make a difference. So this is a teeny tiny example, but I was reading an op-ed this morning by Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, about American tax policy. And he used the 99%, 1% frame to frame his argument about tax policy. And I mean, I know Joe. So I've been talking to Joe about economics for a while. And I could tell in reading that piece that his own thinking had changed, actually, and that he had a more pointed policy argument because he had accepted the 1%, 99% meme, and therefore had accepted the inequality argument at a much more fundamental level than he had previously. So to the degree that the inequality argument makes more sense to people, it sort of gets through the consciousness, on the back of that meme, that kind of meme work or sort of soundbite work does make a difference. So yes, I think beliefs need to change. I think there are ways of changing them. Occupy Wall Street was actually a contribution to that. And I expect that we will see our policy discourse in the US shifting over the course of the next couple of years that in ways that reflect the value of that frame.
Okay. We have one last question from the lady here in the grey sweater that's been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Very quickly, I just wanted to ask you, or for you to expand on that idea when you said that you supported the soundbite. You would sort of say it can be used positively, and then you said, but it has to be based on something philosophical and meaningful. So I'm just curious as to what kind of philosophy that you might be referring to.
In the 99%, 1% meme, or just in general?
Sound bites can be useful because they can be conceptual, they can have meaning.
Right.
And I do recall Wittgenstein who said there's no meaning without context. So a bridging could be positive or it could be coercive. It depends on what kind of bridging or who's doing the bridging. But I'm just curious, as you said, your soundbite is based on philosophy. So I'm just wondering what's kind of philosophy, what position?
That's the argument I gave you, yeah. Well, the argument I gave you, so it's the work I'm trying to do.
Where would I put that philosophically? I'm not really sure. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just trying to, what are you saying, Athenian, Aristotle? I'm just kind of, because the word philosophy doesn't have a meaning to me at the moment. I'm not understanding what does it mean?
So I should say first, so thank you very much. So it's a good and helpful question. I want to refer to the propaganda exhibit a little bit, because that's another way of thinking about sound bites is on the propaganda side of the picture, and that's a helpful contrast, because when I say I think sound bites need to be earned, and I say there needs to be a philosophy behind them, then for me it needs to be something that can be argued about, that there's context for arguing about, and that is up for grabs. It's sort of open for debate as opposed to propagandistic context. Right, so the point is, a soundbite, it's not enough that there just be sound bites. Behind sound bites, there have to be arguments, and people who are willing to make reasoned arguments with one another and try to convince each other. So it's a persuasion-oriented argument as opposed to a sort of rhetorical force-based argument as applies to propaganda. But with regard to the particular sound bites for which I'm advocating, so to speak, the answer to your question about what's the philosophy is mainly that. Sort of what I tried to trace out a little bit in the course of my slides. I spend time trying to think about how human beings might live well together. I've come to the conviction that democracy is a huge part of the answer to that question. And so the work that I do is what people would refer to as democratic theory. So philosophically speaking, what does it take to make a democracy work? What does it take to make democracy real in our day-to-day lives and so forth? So the philosophy I'm referring to in my own case is just my own effort to answer those questions about democracy.
Right, thank you.
Make sense?
Great. Okay. Well, that draws us to the end of tonight's event, and on behalf of everyone here, I'd very much like to thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
It's been a great evening. I've very much enjoyed hearing about the democratisation of association and some of the difficulties which we can encounter in doing that with other social dynamics that are in train. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.